Many people will hear this speech from Mark Rutte and think, okay, NATO chief says Russia bad, we must spend more, usual story. But this is not just routine messaging. In Berlin, he is laying out something like a pre-war budget speech. He is trying to mentally move Europe from peacetime psychology to mobilization psychology, without using the word mobilization too loudly. Let's unpack what he really said and what he carefully did not say. First, the core line. We are Russia's next target. We are already in harm's way. That is not classic NATO language. Old NATO style was always: we will defend every inch of Allied territory, but there is no imminent threat. Calm, lawyer language. Here you have a Secretary General saying openly, if Ukraine loses, if Putin gets what he wants, the next phase is pressure directly on NATO countries. He backs this up with three pillars. Number one, Russia's war machine is now fully on war footing. He quotes numbers. Around 2,000 land attack and ballistic missiles produced last year, close to peak production. Thousands of drones every month, a huge share of machine tools in Russia diverted to military industry. The message is simple. Russia is no longer half in, half out of war economy. It lives inside war economy. Number two, this war machine survives because of China and the axis of sanctions evasion. Iran, North Korea, a network of intermediaries. Rutte says about 80% of critical electronics in Russian systems come from China. That means something very important. The West can sanction Russia all day. If China keeps funneling components, the attrition war can continue. Number three, he says very clearly that Russia could be ready to use force against NATO within 5 years. Not theoretical risk, not long-term concern, a time window. In strategy world, when you start putting dates on threats, you are preparing the public for structural change. Higher budgets, new laws, maybe conscription, maybe emergency powers. So what is he trying to do? He is building the story for the 5% of GDP Defense Pledge by 2035. Before, NATO talked about 2% and could barely get half the members there. Now they have agreed on 5%, with around 3.5 for classic defense and 1.5 for resilience, cyber infrastructure. On paper, this is huge, historic. In reality, it is only possible if voters accept that defense becomes one of the top two items in national budgets, next to health and pensions. This is why he uses such vivid language. We must prepare for the scale of war our grandparents and great-grandparents endured. Conflict at our door. Every home, every workplace. This is not the vocabulary of minor border dispute. This is vocabulary of total war, used not to announce war, but to sell deterrence. Now look how he structures the villain. Putin, in his narrative, is not simply an aggressive neighbor. He is described as empire builder, willing to waste his own people, spending 40% of state budget on aggression, turning industry into weapons factory, sacrificing basic prosperity. Then comes the rhetorical question. If he is ready to pay this price in Russian blood and Russian living standards, what is he prepared to do to us? Here Rutte is doing something clever. He is not primarily speaking to Moscow. He is speaking to German, Dutch, Italian, Spanish voters who are tired of this war, tired of headlines, tired of numbers. He tries to shock them. You think this is just about Donetsk or Kherson? No. Picture missiles flying toward your cities. Picture energy cuts, sabotage, drones over your infrastructure. He wants to connect Ukraine's fate directly with their electricity bills, their jobs, their kids. Then you have the other actor in his speech, Donald Trump. Rutte says in almost campaign language that President Trump wants to end the bloodshed now, and he is the only one who can get Putin to the negotiating table. This is remarkable for NATO Secretary General. Normally, this office avoids such personalization. But we live in time where NATO's entire long-term planning depends heavily on what one man in Washington decides to do. So Rutte is trying to square a circle. On one hand, he tells Europe, Russia can be ready to hit NATO within 5 years. We must shift to wartime mindset. We must spend like never before. On the other hand, he reassures Trump and his supporters. Your idea of ending the war fast, of pushing for negotiations, we take it seriously. We will put Putin to the test. He is basically telling both sides what they need to hear to keep the alliance together. Now let's talk about money and reality. 5% of GDP for defense and security is not a small adjustment. For many European countries, this means literally doubling or even tripling current budgets over next decade. That money must come from somewhere. Higher taxes, more debt, or cuts to other spending. Rutte actually hints at this when he sketches his bad scenario. If Ukraine falls, NATO suddenly must station much larger forces on extended frontline. Emergency budgets, painful trade-offs, rushed procurement. He is saying, either you pay now in somewhat controlled way, or you pay later in chaotic way. But here is the quiet contradiction. He knows that many governments already struggle to hit 2%. Germany already admits it will likely miss its own 3.5% target by 2029. Italy has enormous debts and only just reached around 2. This is why he uses words like we must act now and we cannot falter or fail. He's trying to create moral pressure so high that it overcomes fiscal resistance. Think of this like apartment building with very old wiring. The electrician comes and says, look, if you do not replace entire system in next 5 years, there is serious risk of fire. The tenants look at bill and say, this is crazy, I cannot pay this. Maybe we just change one fuse and hope for best. Rutte is that electrician, walking from door to door, saying, no, really, this time you must pay, because if one flat burns, whole building goes. There is also industrial side. When he speaks about ammunition production, six-fold increase in European 155mm shells, new factories, thousands of Patriot missiles flowing through this Pearl initiative. He's telling arms industry, your golden decade is here. Build capacity, hire people, expand. For United States industry, this is especially good news, because Pearl is basically a mechanism where Europeans pay, Americans deliver high-end systems, and NATO badge is put on top. If you are in Washington, this looks like win-win. Europe spends more, buys more American kit, and US still holds the key segments of alliance capability. If you are in Berlin or Rome, it is more complicated. You must convince your voters that buying another 100 billion in weapons is more urgent than new hospitals, railways, or climate investments. Now, is Rutte exaggerating the Russian threat? Let's be honest about this. Russia is bleeding horribly in Ukraine. Over 1 million casualties since 2022, according to Western estimates. Huge budget commitment to war, falling living standards, brain drain. This not sustainable forever. But unsustainable does not mean weak tomorrow. Short term, a society can absorb massive pain if propaganda machine keeps people passive and if there is external support from China and others. In late Soviet period, the system was also unsustainable, but it still had enough tanks and missiles to blow up world. So Rutte's argument is, do not look at Russia's GDP and laugh. Look at the share of that GDP now dedicated to war. A smaller economy that spends 7 or 8% on hard power can be more dangerous than richer economy that spends 1.5. This is not Cold War superpower competition. This is hungry bear versus sleepy herd problem. On the other hand, there is risk of over-militarization. If every political problem in Europe is framed through lens of imminent war, you get permission structure for all kinds of things. Weaker civil liberties, heavier surveillance, fast-track laws, more secrecy. A wartime mindset can be useful for mobilizing industry. It is also dangerous if it becomes permanent psychology. You can sleepwalk into security state where almost everything is justified by pointing at Kremlin. So how to balance this? For me, 3 points are crucial. First, Ukraine really is the front line of European security. You do not have to like Ukrainian government. You do not have to agree with every decision. To see basic logic, if Russia wins big there, it proves that changing borders by force in Europe is again possible. This would send a message not only to Baltic states and Poland, but also to any other revisionist actors watching from far away. So, long term, cheaper to make sure Ukraine can hold line than to suddenly rearm half the continent in panic later. Second, spending must be serious, not creative accounting. If governments promise 5% and then reach it by renaming all the infrastructure projects dual use, or counting police budget as security, then this is theater, not defense. If you tell your voters we are in pre-war decade, we must prepare, then you have moral obligation to make every euro effective. Training, maintenance, ammunition stocks, air defense, cybersecurity, civil defense. Not prestige projects, not overpriced toys. Third, citizens must be treated like adults. You cannot ask people for wartime mindset on Monday and then pretend on Tuesday that nothing will change in their daily life. Wartime mindset means certain things. Maybe reserve duty becomes normal again. Maybe companies must keep emergency stocks. Maybe governments insist on more robust infrastructure even if it is slower and more expensive. It also means open conversation about escalation risks, about red lines, about how far NATO is willing to go and under what conditions. Rutte ends with emotional imagery. The silence over Ukraine, bodies pulled from rubble, people who may not wake up tomorrow. Then he says, what stands between this and us is NATO. This is diplomatic way of saying, if we let Ukraine fail, we are inviting that same nightmare closer to ourselves. You do not have to fully agree with his timeline, his numbers, or his emphasis on Trump as unique peacemaker. But you should hear clearly what he is signaling. The post-Cold War holiday is over. Europe is moving, slowly and clumsily, into an era where defense is central again. If politicians pretend this is minor adjustment, they lie. If societies ignore it, they sleep. So the real question after this Berlin speech is not whether Russia bad. We know this. The real question is whether European democracies can act like strategic adults. Protect themselves without losing their soul. Invest in defense without destroying their economies. Keep Ukraine alive without drifting into direct great power war. Wartime mindset, if we use this phrase, should mean one simple thing. We prepare seriously now so that our children do not have to fight later. If this is the conversation Rutte wants to start, then yes, it is long overdue.